Welcome and good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Erin Wright, and I'm a member of the Right to Health planning team for this webinar. Right to Health is a grassroots movement of volunteers dedicated to pragmatically fighting for health equity. We came together as a team in response to the COVID-19 pandemic based on a belief that health is a human right. Before we dive into today's discussion, we as the Right to Health community would like to acknowledge this current moment and the important discussions that have recently risen to prominence in public conversation due to horrific incidents of police brutality and racial violence. As an organization committed to the right to health, we acknowledge the scourge of racism as a pandemic and public health crisis. As an organization, we promise to commit ourselves to the ongoing responsibility of dismantling racism and to understanding and leveraging the various privileges and positions we hold for justice and equity. In our last webinar, we discussed how racism and economic domination have powerfully shaped who is most at risk of contracting and ultimately dying from COVID-19. Racial capitalism determines who lives, who dies, and ultimately who cares. Today, we will dive into another important facet of these intersecting issues that have led to the deep inequities we observe in COVID-19 outcomes, access to essential medicines. We hope that today's discussion will demystify the process of drug development, the politics of drug pricing, and how we can fight to ensure universal and equitable access to the medicines and tools necessary to stop this current pandemic and prevent others in the future. We will begin today with a panel discussion with a diverse group of individuals committed to work in the access to medicine sphere. Today's panelists are Zain Rizvi, law and policy researcher at Public Citizen, Navya Dasari, coordinating committee fellow for Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, and Afton Cissell, senior counsel for Congressman Lloyd, Doggett. Following our panel and audience Q&A, we will invite each of you to join a small group discussion to debrief, highlight points of resonance, and discuss concrete actions we can each take in this very important moment. We have a team of trained small group facilitators who have stepped up to create space for these conversations, and we want to offer a huge thanks to them for taking this on. After our small group discussions, we will once again join together as a larger group to debrief next steps regarding the actions we hope each of you will elect to take. A couple of notes on technology. All attendees will be muted during the panel discussion. You could submit questions via the Q&A tool at any time. We will refer to these questions during our Q&A time following the panel discussion. Shout out to Connor from our team who is typing out closed captioning during our panel. We are also recording the panel portion of this webinar to be shared within the coming week. After the panel and Q&A, we will share specific instructions surrounding the logistics for moving to our small group discussions. One last word of thanks. We have an amazing team of more than 30 people who have met multiple times per week and put in many hours putting this together. Thank you to all of them. If you're interested in being involved going forward, we'll be following up with information on how that is possible. With that, I'm pleased to introduce you to Victor Roy, our moderator for this afternoon's discussion. Victor is a doctor and sociologist committed to equitable access to medicines. As a researcher at Cambridge University in the UK, and then UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, he is focused on demystifying the deleterious impacts of shareholder-driven models of drug development and pricing, as well as promoting alternative innovation systems. Currently, he is also a family medicine resident physician at Boston Medical Center and Codman Square Health Center. Thank you. Victor?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Erin. Thanks so much for the introduction, and it's great to join with all of you in this really important discussion. I want to just thank the organizing team, all the speakers that have joined us, and everyone that's tuning into the Zoom from across the country and even around the world to really think through and then take action on access to medicines and then hopefully vaccines for COVID-19. I wanted to start off the discussion just by laying out a couple of basic premises behind why I think we're all here today. And then we're gonna dive right into the discussion with each of our speakers before we go into the breakout sessions. So the 5 premises. One is just the obvious fact that COVID-19 is presenting a challenge of which one arm is going to require new technologies, new medicines, and hopefully vaccines, and that really any kind of safe restarting and reopening of our economy in the long run is going to require that. The second premise is that the pandemic isn't over until it's over everywhere. So when we're thinking about technologies, when we're thinking about medicines and vaccines, we really have to think about this in a global way. From the basic fact that this is an infectious virus that does not know national borders. I think the third premise here is to recognize that there are certain groups and populations that are experiencing disproportionately the harms caused by COVID-19. In the US, we see Black and brown communities around the world in low and middle income countries, many of which are post-colonial states. We have to understand and recognize that the way we do biomedical innovation can either exacerbate the inequities that we're seeing, the legacies of structural racism, or they can help us at least chart a different kind of course. And so part of that is really important to this discussion. The fourth premise here is that the prevailing status quo that we have around how we do biomedical innovation, the shareholder financial market driven model will fail us in this moment if we try and do business as usual. Because the prices will be too high for many health systems and for our patients, be based on powers given to big corporations over knowledge that we all helped in many ways shape and create through public investments in science, all to benefit a small group of shareholders in financial markets who expect not only profits, but growth in profits year in and year out. And this all runs counter to what we need in this moment, which is a real public mission to deliver the kinds of treatments and vaccines that we need. And without that kind of a direction, the risk or the reality for many will be a kind of a treatment apartheid or a vaccine apartheid within our countries and across the world. And so that brings us to our fifth premise, which is that we can help change the course of this, that we have a role to play in determining which direction we go in. COVID-19, I think, has shined a light on so many different breaks in our society, and it's also now shining a light on how we do drug development, vaccine development, how we price and create accessibility for literally the things that can protect us and save lives. And so it's a moment in which your energies, your action, your organizing around this can be really important. Particularly in an election season when there are new political windows that are going to be opening up, in part because of also the work that you all may be able to take part in the coming months. So we'll be speaking specifically to some of those actions, to specific bills, to the way we might be able to engage the Biden campaign, and a lot of that will also happen in the breakout discussion. But part of the discussion I think we're going to have with our group now is to dive into this challenge, to understand it from a few different facets. There's a lot of mystification that goes into debates around drug pricing, drug development, oftentimes myths that are produced by people that have a lot more money and power, but we all also have the power to take this moment to understand some of the issues at hand, to dive into them, ask questions, and then to take action. So to do that, Aaron already did a great job of introducing our three speakers. I'm going to be introducing each one by one, but we're going to start with Zain Rizvi. He is the law and policy researcher at Public Citizen. They've been doing a lot of great work around access to medicines in general, and in this particular moment around COVID-19, I really encourage you to read some of the work that Zain's been producing around COVID on their website, some of the reports around drug and vaccine development for COVID. So Zain, I'll turn it over to you.
One kind of caveat to make is that I am here as an educator on some of these issues, and of course, not taking positions electorally or any context like that. So I think the first question we have to ask is, what do we need? What does this moment demand of us? And I think, we're seeing the impact of COVID-19 everywhere right now. We're seeing how the waves that, started in China, went to Europe, now are in the US, and now are also spreading in low and middle income countries, in Latin America, in Africa. The pandemic is in many ways getting much, much more severe and much worse. And so one of the key remedies we hope to have are medicines, effective medicines. We hope to have treatments and vaccines that will allow us to wake up from this global nightmare. But the only way we can ensure that we all wake up, or the only way we can make sure that we all get out of this global nightmare, is if all of us have access to these latest medicines that are developed. I'm sure you have been inundated with news about the latest and greatest vaccine that is being developed, or a treatment, et cetera, et cetera. And like one caveat to make is that we don't actually know yet if we will have an effective or safe vaccine. We don't actually know, what treatment is going to be safe and effective. And so there is a lot of uncertainty. But that being said, there is an enormous opportunity here, and there's an enormous moment here, actually. The COVID-19 pandemic, will be remembered as one of the transformational moments of the 21st century. And unless we act now to make sure that medicines will be affordable and that medicines will be accessible to and available to everyone that needs them, then we're going to face a global catastrophe. This is, we have seen this. You look at the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and literally that's what we did. There was, and I know many others will touch on this as well, but during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, there were medicines that were available and that were effective and they were safe, but they were priced completely out of reach for millions of people. And literally millions of people died as a result in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in all around the world, actually. And so we can't make that same mistake again. We can't make the mistake of where we let, technologies being developed here, we keep them out of the reach of millions of people for years. That's just not what we can afford at this moment. So the reason we have so much concern about how medicine access will play out is because the way our medicine development system is structured right now is that we grant these for-profit corporations monopolies. We give them patents, we give them exclusivities, we give them all kinds of technical things. But the idea is that we give corporations the ability to not only set price, we also give corporations the ability to control supply. We essentially give corporations the ability to control this vital resource. And you might be thinking, why would we ever do that? Why would we give a single corporation the ability to, privatize or have control over these precious essential goods? Why do we treat them like these commodities, as if they're, something of little value? Why do we do this? And the idea is that what the pharmaceutical industry claims is that, you've seen the sexy press releases of the latest technology. The pharmaceutical industry claims that we need these monopolies because these monopolies are essential to innovation. If we did not have the monopoly, then we would not innovate, we would not invest, we would not do this. That's what the pharmaceutical industry claims. And so this whole system is based on this one premise. But if you really examine the premise and if you look at what's really going on, then you come to understand that, wait, what are we achieving with this system? Like in this country alone, in the richest country in the history of civilization, last year, 58 million people reported rationing their treatment due to cost. Twice as many people of color reported knowing someone who died from rationing treatment than white people. These are the products of the system we have. And we have this R&D myth that we, that many believe. And you will find as you keep digging into these issues is that the public sector actually has a foundational, transformative role in how medical innovation is done. And so let me give you an example. You might have heard of the Moderna vaccine. The Moderna is a small biotech. It is developing a vaccine with the National Institutes of Health. And, they're still in phase 1. They're going to go through other advanced stages of clinical trials soon. And what is the story of Moderna? The story of Moderna, begins with a scientific paper that was publicly funded. Public money went into the scientists who were, developing these new techniques, vaccines, et cetera. And this is way back when, like 2012, 2013, even a bit earlier than that. And then when the company was first being launched, the US government, gave them some significant money to test their technology to see, is this new way of vaccines, could it actually work? And then over the years, they received significant contributions from the US government, from various branches, from the Department of Defense to the Health and Human Services. And each step along the way, Moderna has benefited from public funding. And so when the COVID-19, crisis emerged and Moderna and NIH sprang into action, National Institutes of Health actually helped design the vaccine. If you look at Moderna's press releases, they say National Institutes of Health helped us design this vaccine. And then the National Institutes of Health actually helped run the initial testing. And now they are expected to actually run the phase 3 trial as well. And so, this is just one example, but it is an example of how far public funding goes. Moderna has recently received $483 million from another division of HHS called BARDA. And they received $483 million to help scale up development and to also start scaling up manufacturing. Because again, we want vaccines and treatments to be immediately accessible and available as soon as they're proven effective and safe. And so now Moderna has benefited from hundreds of millions of dollars of public money. And yet they have no obligation to act in the public interest. They can set whatever price they want. They can make decisions that prioritize their private profits, and they don't have to act in any way that maximizes public health. And so let me give you an example. We talk a lot about price because price is important, of course, and it can mean, the difference between life and death for so many millions of people. But an equally important issue is supply. Moderna right now has committed to making up to 1 billion doses, between 500 to 1 billion doses, which sounds like a lot, except when you think about it, each vaccine course is expected to take 2 doses. So you divide those numbers by 2. So you get Moderna right now, if its vaccine proves safe and effective, they're hoping to produce between 250 and 500 million courses of vaccination that can affect basically for 250 to 500 million people. What is the global population? It is not 250 to 500 million, right? We need massive, massive scale up of the technology, of manufacturing, of investments. And we need it in a way that is collaborative and is engaging with other countries and is engaging and accelerating the science. When we conduct this monopolized based science, it's not just about access and affordability and supply. It's also fundamentally about the science itself. If people are working in silos, if team, one private corporation is in its own lane and another private corporation is in its own lane, they're not sharing knowledge. They're not sharing information that is vital to advancing science. And so we're in a position where there's, hundreds of candidates, dozens of candidates, dozens of companies going ahead, and they're issuing press releases about how their medicines will be affordable and not for profit, et cetera, et cetera. And yet there is no accountability. There is no transparency. We don't know what the contracts say. We don't know what these companies may actually be able to deliver at what time frame. And fundamentally, there's just this lack of understanding that the companies are not racing against each other. Countries are not racing against each other either. It is humanity versus the virus. And what we need to do is make sure that we exercise all mechanisms that we have to promote affordability. We have all mechanisms to promote supply and all mechanisms to make sure that we have open science. And so I know some of the other panelists are going to touch on these, but the good news is that we actually have many of these authorities under existing law, and we have legislation that would even expand and go further and help us do even more things. And so I'll wrap up by saying it's just, I can't overstate just how critical this moment is, both for this country, but for all around the world. To me, it feels like a critical juncture in history, and I hope that you all will choose to be engaged because we need your help.
Thank you so much, Zain, for laying that out and for the urgency in your call. Just one thought here is that I want to make sure that everyone knows we're going to go through the speakers, but questions are welcome. So use the feature to make sure if there's questions that you have specifically for Zain, but any of the speakers here, share them, and then I'll be able to ask some of them at least based on how much time we have. But thanks again, Zain. So next up is going to be Navya Dasari. She's a leader with the team for Universities for Allied for Essential Medicines, UAEM. They've been involved with access to medicines for many, many years now. And particularly now, they're part of a campaign called Free the Vaccines. Navya is going to be sharing some of her perspectives around organizing, and we're looking forward to listening to her. Take it away, Navya.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, Right to Health, for having me. So as Victor said, I'm a coordinating committee fellow for Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. And as the title would suggest, we primarily focus on the role of universities in the access to medicines crisis. So this is in part because we are a student-led organization, but it's also because the majority of actual innovation that's happening with medicines is coming from universities and coming from research that is publicly funded. So I think the last 200 drugs that were approved by the FDA were actually produced with research that was funded by the NIH and largely through universities. And yet the status quo is that universities will do research and then they will exclusively license drugs to pharmaceutical companies, which then have a monopoly on the drug and can charge as much as they want for it. But we know that another approach is possible. So UAM actually began in 2001 when a group of students at Yale found out about an HIV drug called Stabidine, which had been discovered at Yale with public funding, but was now completely unaffordable to people at the height of the AIDS epidemic in South Africa. And the South African government and Bristol Myers Squibb were, the South African government and Doctors Without Borders were trying to create the first HIV clinic in sub-Saharan Africa, but they weren't able to afford Stabidine. And so students at Yale put pressure on the university and on Bristol Myers Squibb to renegotiate their licensing agreement, and they did. And the price dropped 30-fold overnight. And so I can definitely talk more about other work that UAM has done since then if people have questions about it. But I want to focus on telling you more about the Free the Vaccine campaign. So we recently started this campaign in partnership with the Center for Artistic Activism. And our goal is to make sure that publicly funded vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments for COVID-19 are sustainably priced, available to all, and free at the point of delivery. And so we have this sort of virtual organizing system where we have 300 people signed up from 29 countries. And this is not just students, it's faculty, but it's also artists, other activists, people who have no exposure to these issues at all. It's a really diverse group, and they're all pushing for this goal of freeing the vaccine. And we recently had a UAM mapping project that looked at the amount of public funding that's already gone into COVID-19 research, and it's millions and millions. And you can see this information at this website. We have publicmedsforcovid.org. But what we're seeing is that there's tons of public funding that's going into this research, and we need to make sure that the products are affordable to the people, especially the people who are funding it. And so right now we're pushing for institutions, universities and other research institutions to sign the Open COVID Pledge. So this is a commitment that they can make to make their coronavirus related IP freely available. They have licenses ready for institutions to adopt, or institutions can adopt their own sort of customized license. There are a lot of tech companies that have signed on to the pledge so far: Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. And this is important in case they are creating contact tracing technologies, but we still really need institutions that are working on biomedical research to sign on. And so that's why this is our focus. So I want to emphasize that if people want to get involved, like, there's a very low barrier to take action. We have a take action section on our website that has, just petitions that people could sign, 5-minute actions that they can take, in addition to all the people in our actual program who are engaging with institutions on a weekly basis. I also want to address why it's so important for us to take action right now, right? Like, why are we doing this campaign now when we don't know which vaccines are actually going to be viable, which drugs are actually going to be effective? And that's because the decisions that are made right now are the ones that will impact access in the end. Licensing agreements that are adopted now are going to impact access, exclusivity, which companies have monopolies. And we know that pharmaceutical companies are trying to make these little concessions to access right now. They're trying to avoid transformative change, and we need to push in that direction. I also want to highlight that this is a global justice issue. So the pandemic has highlighted that our system is not equipped to address public health needs. It's entirely profit-driven, which means it is not equipped to incentivize research that doesn't have an immediate profit motive behind it. And that's why we weren't prepared for this pandemic. We didn't have research already ongoing for a coronavirus vaccine or treatment because the system is designed to only address the needs of the wealthy and wealthy countries, and also whatever will create an immediate profit, whatever already has a strong market. And so UAM really pushes for a needs-driven biomedical R&D system. So just to give you an example of what this means, I want to talk a little bit about my past work at the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. So DNDI had, it's a nonprofit research and development organization that partners with governments and pharmaceutical companies to create treatments for diseases that primarily impact marginalized populations. And so they created this treatment for sleeping sickness, which is a fatal disease that primarily impacts people in the DRC in the Congo. And for years, the only treatments available were ones that killed 1 out of 20 of their patients, or that required a painful lumbar puncture, an IV, an enormous burden on the health system. And there was no research in this area because there was no profit to be made until DNDI stepped in. But that shouldn't be necessary, right? 1 in 6 people globally have a neglected disease. And the research is not occurring because there's not a profit to be made off of these populations. So we have an opportunity to transform the system right now. The pandemic has shown that the system as it is does not work. And we have a responsibility to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. So we can do this by changing public policy, and that's incredibly important, and that's part of what UAM tries to do. But we also have the opportunity to put pressure directly on research institutions and change the way they function. Because right now, the administrations of universities primarily hear about this stuff from pharmaceutical companies. They know what pharmaceutical companies want. They don't hear as much from their students, from faculty, from just the public, the communities that they're part of, about how we need to change the way that technology transfer is done, the way licensing is done, the way research goes through the pipeline and to market. So yeah, I think that's it for my piece right now, and I'm happy to answer other questions.
Thanks, Navya. Thanks so much for sharing that background and that perspective too. Much more to talk about. We want to go to our third speaker here, Afton Cissell. She is senior counsel with the Lloyd Doggett, the Congressman Lloyd Doggett, and has been a which as a team has been really progressive on these issues, been an important voice as well as source of legislation. And so Afton's going to give us that view from the government and the power that our country has to shape the trajectory of all of this.
Great. Thanks, Victor, and thanks to Right to Health for having me. I love that you called him the Lloyd Doggett at first. We've got a funny saying in our office. His wife, Libby, at one point emailed us after she had given a speech somewhere, and she, we were thanking her for it. She's like, "Don't worry, I was just doing the Lloyd's work." And so it has become our favorite catchphrase in the office. We're just doing the Lloyd's work. But I want to thank all of you for having me here today. Far be it from me to quote Donald Trump or think that he is right about anything, but I do believe everybody gets something right at some point in their life. And when he was candidate Trump, he said the drug companies are getting away with murder. And he was absolutely right. I have constituents that call us all of the time because they walk into a pharmacy and they find out that their prescription is going to cost them $1,200 and they don't have that money and they walk out without their medications. In fact, our own district director right now is being charged $300 a month for her allergy medication. She's never spent more than $25 for it, but they're suddenly price gouging during the pandemic. And so I see these kinds of stories every single day in our work, and we know that patients across the globe are rationing and going without and dying because of it. And so after candidate Trump said that, when he unfortunately took office, we decided to, call him up on it and point out some of the authorities that he already had in his power to go ahead and lower prices. And so we sent his administration a letter calling on him to use these different authorities. And so there's really three key things that the administration could already be doing and they have failed to ever do, despite repeated requests from us, from the other panelists here and the organizations that they represent have pushed this administration for these things. And we have been doing this for many years. And it's important to think about, I know that thinking about the Biden campaign and some of the action items that you can take there, these are some of the authorities that you can keep in mind as you're thinking about how to exert pressure. So there's three key things. As Zain was talking about, there is a lot of US taxpayer money that is going into pharmaceutical research. We are giving grants through the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. We give it through the Department of Defense and their research programs. We give it through BARDA, this obscure little agency within, or department within HHS. We give it through a lot of different places, and it's billions of dollars. I think it's roughly $30 billion a year that's going out in US taxpayer money for R&D. And we right now are giving it away no strings attached. But the government could absolutely choose to add some strings. They are the ones that control these contracts, and they could include within those contracts that the products are going to have to be reasonably priced, that the actual information, the intellectual property needs to be publicly available, and it needs to be openly licensed to where other companies can manufacture. The government could choose to start manufacturing the drugs that it helps to develop on its own. There are a lot of different things they could be doing and different things they could be adding into these contracts, but they failed to do that. So that's one way that we could go ahead and already start lowering prices and opening up access. A second authority is it's typically called margin rights. And it's this idea that if the US taxpayers helped to invent this drug, they helped pay for the development, and often government researchers and government facilities are involved in the development. If we have an ownership stake in this drug, then at any point we can march in and demand these types of conditions. We could demand that they be reasonably priced. We could demand that that information be publicly available and that there are open licenses. The third tool, and it's very similar, but it's been around much longer, and it actually has been frequently used, just not on pharmaceuticals. It has for pharmaceuticals, but not in recent memory. And so this is what we call, it's called Section 1498, and it's government use licensing. And this is where, again, it actually doesn't require that the government help to create this product. We can do this on any patent, regardless of whether there was taxpayer investment. If we saw that there was a drug that was fully developed by a pharmaceutical company, but it was just really, really important that it be available and accessible and affordably priced for all, we could go ahead and decide, we are going to have this government use license where we open up that intellectual property so that other manufacturers can go ahead and start producing this drug. And in exchange, we will pay a fair royalty fee to the pharmaceutical company in exchange for doing that. So those are 3 different tools that are already on the books, absolutely available to any administration to use. And it's really notable for people to remember that out of all of the Democratic candidates, obviously we had a very wide field this campaign. Candidate Biden was the only one that did not commit to using any of those tools. When he put out his pharmaceutical plan, it did not include this, but other candidates did, even the much more moderate ones. And so really important that we remember that this is not something that he was already willing to consider. So it's going to take that much more activism and people power to get his administration on board with this. And then I just wanted to transition into what is happening on the legislative side, because we do have an administration that is refusing to do anything despite the billions of dollars that we're pouring into R&D, and despite the extreme significance of this moment and what COVID-19 treatments and vaccines are going to mean. And so because this administration refuses to use their authorities, and in fact, when they were asked, will you commit to reasonable prices, they said price controls don't work, and pharmaceutical companies won't invest and they won't create these products if we try and talk about price controls. And so in Congress, we have been developing legislation that would ensure that these drugs are all fairly priced and that they also are openly licensed so that multiple manufacturers can go ahead and produce them. And that's not just important from a pricing perspective or just the idea that, it should be open source knowledge, which in my book is just sort of common sense. But it's also really important because, as Zain pointed out, we have a huge supply demand need here. It's the entire world is going to need access to these drugs, and no one company is going to be able to produce enough doses. And so we need everybody involved here. And so that is also why the open licensing piece is so important. And so we are going to be introducing legislation on Monday that would have these two components of fair pricing and open licensing. And then in addition to that, we're introducing a second bill that is tracking all of the investment that has been made into these drugs and the diagnostic tests and any of these like biomedical COVID products. And so we are looking at, it would be a single database that would be publicly available. All of the information would be public, and it would track all of the money that was put into all of these drugs before the pandemic even began. There's a really great report that Public Citizen put out that Zain wrote related to coronavirus research before COVID-19. And so that was about $700 million that we know of that was put into coronavirus research before the pandemic even started. We have, in Congress, have already appropriated $7.5 billion that is going out right now into COVID R&D. And then there's billions more that is just sort of an open pot of money that they can use for many different purposes, including for COVID-19 R&D. And so we're talking about a lot of money. And right now it is next to impossible to find out where that money actually went. The information is scattered across a lot of different databases. It's incomplete, and it doesn't tell us the whole story. It doesn't tell us what were the terms and conditions related to this funding. What did you actually put in your contract agreements? Are we also like helping to manufacture these drugs? Are you putting money into the manufacturing facilities? Does the government have a patent ownership interest in this drug? Because sometimes we do. Sometimes there are government researchers that are on these patents. And so also a great story, everybody, you know, when Gilead, when the remdesivir treatment got its emergency use authorization, everybody thought that it was so wonderful that they were going to donate their existing supply. You know, it was their great PR move. They got a lot of credit. Their CEO went on all the morning news shows and everybody was praising him. Well, guess what? They get to write that off. They're gonna get the tax money because of that. It was a charitable contribution. They are going to get a tax deduction. And so part of the information that would be required under this new legislation is, what are all of the tax benefits that you're also getting for your charitable contributions? And we also have research and development tax credits. And so we would require that all of the money that they are getting through the tax system would also have to be available. So it would be a very comprehensive database that really paints the entire story of how the taxpayers are truly the angel investors. And one final piece that I just wanted to make, given everything that has happened over the past few weeks and this critical moment that we're in, when COVID-19 hit and we were really starting to roll out testing here in the United States and setting up different testing sites, local governments and state governments chose to put the testing sites primarily in affluent, white majority neighborhoods. And we know that this pandemic is primarily hitting communities of color, and yet even the most basic thing of just being able to get a test and find out whether you have this virus, it can be incredibly difficult for these communities because they don't have testing sites within their own communities. Some cities are doing a better job than others of trying to plan out those logistics and put testing sites in those communities. But that has been a serious problem. And I'm really nervous that we are going to have a very similar system when we start rolling out treatments and vaccines, that they are going to, either because of price or because of just systemic racism and how the planning is developed, they are going to end up with affluent white communities and not with the people who are most in need. And so while we don't have this as a component within our legislation, it is something that I have been thinking about as like our next steps once we get these two bills out the door, of like, we need something related to public health planning and ensuring that we are meeting the communities that are most in need, and that we are providing culturally competent care, and we are providing culturally competent public education. And so I just wanted to add that piece in, because I think that that's really important as we think about all of these issues. And thank you again to all of you for having me.
Thanks, Afton, so much for sharing all of that, and for doing the Lloyd's work, I should say. That's a good story. There's a lot of work there to do. In terms of so thank you all to all three of you for sharing your perspectives. What we want to do right now is that there are a lot of different questions coming in. So I'm just taking a moment to digest them. But I think there's a couple of sort of categories of questions, because we're not going to be able to ask all the specific questions, but at least hit on some of them. So I think one, I'm going to point this first to Zain, but anybody can jump in. And I think this is oftentimes an obstacle in these discussions, is sort of thinking about the industry arguments that are put out there. So we're having a couple of questions, just, industry has put some money behind this. Oftentimes you have a mixed model of public and private money that goes into drug development. How are we supposed to think about, if there are, shared risks? Oftentimes the public actually is the one that's made invisible in terms of the risk taking. But if there are shared risks, sort of how do we think about shared rewards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one critical thing to highlight here is that we do want to reward meaningful innovation, but there has to be a link between the medical innovation and the investments put in and the reward. Right now, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most profitable industries in the world. And if you actually dig into their R&D expenditures, which they actually don't provide transparently, they give these kind of inflated, enormous numbers that most likely do not reflect the actual kind of true costs of doing these things. Things don't add up. I think that's kind of the simplest way to put it. It's just things just don't add up. Like, let me give you a good example. So for a long time, and industry, civil society, I think most people seem to agree that one of the most expensive parts of developing a medicine is actually running the clinical trials. Like, this is I think pretty agreed upon understanding that clinical trials can be sometimes expensive. And over time, we have seen with industry developing drugs that treat smaller and smaller patient populations, for example, that the clinical trials also become smaller and smaller. So for a lot of, for example, cancer medicines, you have clinical trials that are 30, 100, maybe a couple hundred people. And clinical trials sometimes are thousands and thousands of people. So you would expect, if there was a link between R&D costs and prices, that as the size of the clinical trial became smaller and smaller, that the prices would also decrease. That, of course, is not what has happened. Cancer drugs are some of the most expensive drugs. The average price of a cancer drug in the US last year was $149,000. So I think, all the mechanisms we're talking about, whether they're an existing law or whether, there's proposed legislation, all of them understand that there is a role for reasonable royalties to industry for their contribution, that there is a role for some compensation. But what we're trying to do is really highlight the critical role of the public, often at the earliest, riskiest stages in drug development.
Thanks, Zain. I think that the fact that things have become uncoupled or just unlinked is a really important point to make. And I think I'll just also add is, if you look at the way the capital is allocated is for most of these companies, a huge chunk of that, actually a majority in some cases, just ends up going back to the stock market. So isn't actually linked back to, the things that we need for research and development. So another set of questions that I'll start with Navya, but others can jump in too, is a little bit more discussion about the global piece to this. So, we touched a little bit about open science, open access, sort of open licensing approaches, the discussion around patent pools, sort of we touched on. If Navya, maybe if you could highlight sort of what is the idea of pooling knowledge through a patent pool, and where the status of that is right now. And others can jump in because it's a complex topic, but we can at least sort of do the basic kind of translation of it the best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now there's actually an initiative that's being driven by the World Health Organization. It was proposed by Costa Rica, and it's now been established as a voluntary intellectual property pool that is an international sort of initiative. It's unclear whether all countries will be participating in that, especially the United States, but it's actually really important that we have this open, collaborative model of research and of IP, enabling like developing countries and high-income countries alike to have access and to have an equal chance of fighting the pandemic in their countries. And so there's also another model for this is the medicines patent pool, which is a current existing initiative that is, I think it's funded primarily by Unitaid. And that's an initiative that UAM actually partnered with to get a TB drug that was discovered at Hopkins, sutezolid, licensed through the medicines patent pool. And that enables other manufacturers to enter the market for the drug. It prevents one company from having a monopoly. And the idea of the WHO's licensing pool is that it would prevent, one company or one country from having a monopoly or having earlier or better access to a vaccine and treatments. I don't know if that answers the question.
I'll maybe add one thing. I think I agree with what Navya is saying. I think in the simplest way, some of these terms get complicated and kind of wonky and hard to understand, but like, let me break it down in like the simplest terms. Basically, the idea is that suppose you figure out the secret sauce, right? You figure out the secret sauce for making a vaccine, and you have limited capacity to produce the sauce, aka the vaccine, right? And so the idea of these patent pools is to say, hey, when you figure out the secret sauce, please tell everyone what the secret sauce is so it's no longer secret. And like one level of like outrage here is that you're not actually coming up with the secret sauce on your own initiative. The public, aka all of us, is paying you to come up with the secret sauce. And so maybe we should tell you, hey, we're paying you to come up with the sauce, but when you come up with the sauce, you better share with everyone because everyone needs it to survive, And so the idea of the WHO patent pool is this idea of let's make sure that we share the information we generate with the world so all manufacturers from all countries are able to scale up manufacturing and supply the world with the people's vaccine if we're lucky enough to develop one.
Open access sauce. I think that was great. I think as all of us, as we're thinking about organizing and advocating, it's sort of translating some of the stuff we're learning into metaphors like that people can grab onto, because I think that makes a lot of sense. Afton, I wanted to ask you, in terms of making the push for this legislation, what you see as the sort of possibilities for it and kind of the barriers you're going to face and part of what we can do to help, overcome that. Because I think this is part of just like the first step, but, we've seen over and over again in the past that even during the Obama administration, sort of not using these powers in critical cases. So how do we go about changing that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I feel like I'm always the Debbie Downer when I'm asked about this. So it's definitely going to be an uphill battle to actually get this legislation to even be considered and like debated and voted on, let alone become law. The the Trump administration is not, the only one that is scared to take on pharma, as you pointed out. The Obama administration also didn't, and in fact, the Affordable Care Act, for all of the great things that it did, totally sold out to pharma so that they wouldn't oppose the legislation. They didn't go out and actively promote it, but just to keep them from pouring billions of dollars into trying to tank it. So they went ahead and let pharma slide and actually baked in a few things that helped them out. So far, when it comes to the COVID relief packages, big pharma continuously has been the big winner, where they are getting in every bill billions more in taxpayer money for R&D and to help with the manufacturing, and they're getting assurances from CMS that Medicare and Medicaid are going to cover the drugs, and they're getting some insurance companies to guarantee, like, we're going to cover them, and it'll be free to the patient, no cost to the patient. That sounds really wonderful in theory, but somebody is paying for it at some point. Even if you're not paying for it at the pharmacy counter, your insurance company and or the federal government are paying for it, which is your money. It's taxpayer money, it's your insurance premiums, it's your insurance deductibles, it's how they end up making up for it by increasing prices on other products and services. And so no matter what, you're going to end up paying for it until we actually like put some restraint on what the price is going to ultimately be for these drugs. And that is, the one step that pharma has not wanted anyone to take. And Congress so far is, once again, writing a blank check to pharma saying, oh, we're going to help you develop these products and we're not going to put any restraints. There are some members in Congress, like my boss, who care very deeply about this issue, and we want to see good legislation move, but it's a small group, and it's going to be really hard to build the momentum around this, especially when there are so many different issues that are sort of flooding the space right now. And so I think this has really been on the back burner for people as they thought about the response to the pandemic. But it's obviously really critical. This is how we are able to safely reopen our economies and start returning to our normal lives. And so the price of these products is going to really, really matter. I will say the nice thing about the two bills that we're introducing is that they are bipartisan, which is pretty rare in ever on any issue, let alone drug pricing. So we do have a Republican that has joined us, Francis Rooney from Florida, but also Francis Rooney is retiring. And so he doesn't care so much about pharmaceutical lobbyists and all of the money that they pour in. I mean, fun fact, there is a ratio of 2 lobbyists to every member of Congress out of the pharmaceutical industry. And they have more lobbyists and spend more money on lobbying than any other industry, like more than tech, more than defense, more than insurance. Pharma spends more than any other industry. And so it is very difficult and so that's why it's so important that we have grassroots organizing to put the pressure on Congress to act. And if you say that anything less is unacceptable, at some point they're, ultimately you're the ones actually casting the votes. And so they do know that. And so the organizing power is going to be really critical in being able to combat pharma's, giant war chest.
Thanks, Afton. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna return to that with you in terms of, we're gonna sort of have one round where we think a little bit about actions. And sort of, I think for a lot of folks that haven't talked to their congressional office, just the influence that has. So I wanna come back to that and the power that has. Zain, I wanted to ask one question to you here. You highlighted the example of Moderna. actually, I think there were like 5 companies that the administration has selected in terms of potentially for sort of like vaccine development finalists. And I know in a report that you put out, all 5 companies and the research programs can be traced to, or is receiving currently significant public funding. I was wondering if you could just sort of like paint a picture of, in an ideal world, like how this would play out with any one of these companies or a few of these companies in terms of sort of like the pricing and access, just because I think sometimes just laying out the process of how the one alternative path could take is helpful for people to recognize. I know that's like maybe a big question, but you know, I think that can be helpful.
That's a really good question. That's like what are we fighting for? You know, we're you know, in an ideal world, the government would protect the public interest at each step. You know, when you're awarding billions of dollars, you know, so Moderna, I mentioned, got 483 million. AstraZeneca is about to get 1.2 billion. Merck got like, I think so far like 60 million or something around there. J&J got 454 million. You know, like, it's just absurd amount of money is going to these corporations. And in an ideal world, those corporations would have specific obligations to the work that they produce, to share the intellectual property, to have the government, the corporation should you know, have obligations to reasonably price. They should be required to openly license. And so, and by openly license, I mean they should not have a monopoly in case, you know, they are benefiting from the fruits of federal research. I think what we fight for is a world in which the drug development system is not just this massive transfer of wealth from us to private corporations. You know, what we're really fighting for is a world in which, you know, we put in money for medicines because we recognize it's important, but then we're also not charged the highest medicine prices in the world. It's such an obvious thing when you think about it. You put in the money, you see, you know, you attach conditions to drug development, you make sure there's competition, you make sure that there is open licensing, you make sure there's no monopolies, and then you get affordable products. You know, it's quite like it's intellectual property actually creates huge distortions in what, you know, is the so-called free market. You know, it is it doesn't make sense from, it doesn't make sense from so many perspectives, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It really is a strange idea, the idea that your ideas become property. You know, like what at the end of the day, like, what does that, you know, what does that even mean? Like, not only like because I came up with an idea, I'm going to exclude you from using that idea. So if I come up with, you know, an idea for a treatment or vaccine, I am going to block you from making that treatment or vaccine. Like, you know, the notion is always bizarre, but in a pandemic situation is like unconscionable. Can you imagine? You know, this is what the corporations did in South Africa in the 90s, where they were trying to block generic competition. They wanted to block other manufacturers. So I hope that answers your question. I guess the idea is that the government takes a real interest in shaping the market and making sure that it serves the public interest.
I think it's an important set of principles, and I think what we're working on is enacting them and figuring out how to do that, the organizing work around doing that. So yeah, I think what I want to do is just, if everybody could go around just for like a minute or two, specific question is around sort of more how we take action from here, and sort of tailoring it from your perspective. I think, Navya, it would be really great to hear some of the early lessons you guys are learning around the Free the Vaccines campaign, in terms of what are the messages that are really resonating. I think that would be really helpful. Zain, I think from your perspective, you know, obviously you're putting out the knowledge that the public needs, and sort of how to spread that, how to talk about that, and I think that'd be really useful. And then Afton, I think it'd be really great to hear, I think a lot of folks are getting more politically activated in this moment, but haven't before. So what is the influence that people can have to meet with their local congressional official to set up that discussion, and how does that help shape all the public goods that all of us need? So I think that'd be really great to hear from each of you, and then we'll break off. Then we'll have a transition. We'll hear from Paul Davis about why our energies are so needed in this moment, and draw on some previous examples, and then we'll go into breakouts. So if all of you could go around, I'll start with Navya.
Sure. So I think the message that we're really seeing resonate, at least with the institutions that we're targeting, is, they're doing all this research on coronavirus, and they want to see that research recognized. They want to see their scientists celebrated. And we're reminding them that the knowledge that they're producing, the science they're producing, the medicines they're producing, won't actually do anything to help people if people can't afford them. So we're reminding them that they have this public good mission that they have committed to at the founding of their universities, and that if they want to honor their own work, they have to ensure that it can't be corrupted, right? They have to ensure that their mission is carried out to the end. So in a sense, it's reminding them of the power that they themselves have and that they've forgotten that they have. And so one thing that we found works well is we're asking them, okay, like, will you commit to the Open COVID Pledge? Or if you won't, will you tell us what other steps you're taking to promote access so that your community knows what you're doing? So just reminding them that they're going to be held accountable, that there are people who are watching, what they're doing, and that there's suffering that they have the power to stop, I think is what's we're seeing working. And hopefully we'll have like more updates for you very soon in terms of universities signing on to the pledge.
Thanks, Navya. That was great. Zain, do you want to just share from your guys' perspective?
Sure, I'll be really brief. I think, it is, part of this is just deconstructing some of the myths that industry perpetuates. I think I can't emphasize enough how critical it is to recognize and to not only recognize, but to celebrate the role of public investment, public funding, public scientists as the engines of biomedical innovation. And I know it sounds wonky, but I mean, even like specific steps you can take, when you talk about vaccines, or, when you hear your family talk about your vaccines, or your friends talk about vaccines, or, it is not the Moderna vaccine. It is the Moderna and NIH vaccine, just things like that. I mean, like, and don't ever feel like, that your voice somehow does not matter, because actually it does, and actually that, when you speak up about these issues in your own communities, in your own circles, and even if it is just like writing a letter to the editor, you would be surprised how much those matter. It is like just caring and acting upon it makes a huge difference. And so I would encourage all of you to really share what you have learned today with others.
Thanks, Zain. Yeah, I think that's a good segue to somebody that works, in a public official's office and is working on these issues all the time and hearing from constituents.
Yeah, I would say that, especially since, in this moment when we're all socially distancing and trying to stay home as much as possible, obviously it is changing a lot of organizing tactics. We're having to get creative and rethink things, but there's still some of the traditional tools that are still available to you, in terms of, like Zain said, writing a letter to the editor, or, even submitting like an op-ed if you wanted, and then also using social media to engage with your members of Congress. I would just say, in any of these like public forums where you're trying to reach a member or talk about an issue, make sure you always use the member's name. Like, if you are putting something in the press, put the member's name in your letter to the editor. If you are writing something on social media, tag their account, because offices track every single mention of the member's name, and they send reports directly to the member of, here are all of your media mentions, here are all of your social media tags. They send them comprehensive reports of every single mention. So always use their name. That's how you'll be sure to actually get the member's direct attention. And then of course, trying to set up phone calls with members' staff. It can be very difficult to get a meeting with a member, and so you will most likely get a staff member. That's another tool. And then sending emails and letters to the member's office. All of this gets in front of staff, and the more that they hear on a particular topic, the more likely they are to actually elevate it with the member directly. So if I get 5 pieces of mail about something in 1 week, and they're all like on the exact same issue, and it's not just sort of a broad topic of like, well, healthcare is too expensive. The congressman knows that, and I don't need to raise it with him. But if it's 5 different people asking him to co-sponsor the same bill, I'm like, oh wow, that's capturing some attention. We don't normally have many people asking us to co-sponsor things. It's like 1 person at a time. And so if I get a lot of people asking for that, then I talk to the congressman about it. I'm like, hey, there are a bunch of constituents that really want you on this bill. Here's what it does. Here's my recommendation. And so I think quantity and using the member's name over and over and over again are 2 ways to really get their attention.
Thanks, Afton. That was really great to hear from that view. So that, in terms of that's the main part of the discussion. We have had over 120 people tuned in on a Saturday afternoon where it's beautiful across many parts of the country. So I think that just indicates how much people are activated. I want to say though, this is just the first part, and the really important part is to stay on and to think about and to organize around action. And so we've got a great group of people thinking about that, and we'll be facilitating that. So I want to make sure before we go there to sort of to have a perspective from Paul Davis, who has a story to share that all of us talked about. That'd be great for him to share around from a previous campaign as we enter into this election season. I think is going to be relevant and hopefully inspire some of the conversations that we're about to have. Paul?
Hi, everybody. This is a really awesome panel. Thanks a whole lot for all of the lessons that we've learned and expertise that you've shared. I just wanted to share a different story, which starts out 21 years ago. 21 years and 4 days ago, actually. 21 years ago, no one in developing countries, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, had access to HIV medicines. This was 30 million people who could not afford the $10,000 to $12,000 per patient per year that it costs to get the medicines that, as we have learned, were substantially invented with U.S. taxpayer money. We were also hearing this expert consensus from development experts, from the people in charge, from presidents and White Houses, 3 successive White Houses, that it simply wasn't cost effective to provide AIDS treatment, that Africa couldn't take out a treatment mortgage. That's a quote for Africa. Bush administration officials even told the media, the Boston Globe, that Africans have no Western sense of time. Basically, we didn't take their pills, 3 pills a day. Or 1 to 3 pills a day, actually. Basically, what all of them said was that Black lives don't matter. And that was US policy. 21 years ago, a handful of us ACT UPpers, AIDS activists, were leaked a State Department report about an insidious, concerted campaign to punish Nelson Mandela for having passed a law that enabled the South African government to repeal a patent monopoly when necessary to bring prices down. Multinational drug corporations were angry that South Africa had passed this law, and they put a whole lot of pressure on the Clinton administration to force South Africa to repeal it. It's worth noting that they did all this because South Africa had passed a law that said they might break a patent. They had not actually broken a patent. Nonetheless, a gentleman named Al Gore, that you might have heard of, maybe some of you who are older, as a chair of the U.S. South Africa Binational Commission, energetically complied with these big pharma requests and applied sanction after sanction and threat after threat against South Africa. Literally, he applied thumb screws to Nelson Mandela. Okay, I mean, not literal thumb screws. Just the context of the time, you might remember that we were seeing upwards of 25 and 30% HIV infection rates in cities like Durban and Johannesburg. We were, the city of Harare in nearby Zimbabwe literally adopted a policy of burying people 12 feet deep, so that, because they had run out of room. So they needed to be able to bury people on top of other people. That is the context in which the United States said that enforcing basically theoretical patent monopolies on a country where most people could not ever afford was more important than saving lives. So 21 years and 4 days ago, a few activists who had received the State Department report, we got together, we said we're gonna stand up and repeal this policy of medical apartheid. We've been in touch with a few comrades from South Africa and Brazil and Thailand. On 2 days' notice, a van load of them headed off to Tennessee to disrupt Al Gore's first campaign event. I stayed home and called the journalist and in Philly, called the journalist and said, we're in possession of a leaked State Department report about Al Gore versus Nelson Mandela and AIDS drugs for Africa. It will be releasing it in Carthage, Tennessee, the vice president's hometown. Well, the release that they did, they disrupted his appearance. They chanted and chanted and chanted until they were escorted out. It made a huge splash, a giant media splash. We were a little bit overwhelmed by it. And so spontaneously, literally that evening, 2 carloads of folks decided to head to New Hampshire, the vice president's second campaign appearance that he was going to do in the morning. We hadn't planned this. We were sort of picking up people as we're going. We stopped on the way and picked up an old friend, Rachel Maddow, who was at that point literally working as a self-defined houseboy in a bed and breakfast in Western Massachusetts, and she borrowed a sheet from the bed and breakfast. So we got to the event. There were no seats because we got there at like 9:01, but we were young and cute since it was 21 years ago. So they actually put some seats on the stage right behind the vice president's podium, and he starts giving his boring speech, and none less than Rachel Maddow pulls a banner out of her pants, and we painted on there, and it says, "Gore's greed kills, AIDS drugs for Africa," and we're chanting and chanting and chanting until we're escorted out. Huge amounts of press. We hear click, 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 a set of heels, and it is the vice president's campaign director who says, "What the hell do you people want?" There's a lot more to this story, about how we opened our meeting with the vice president's staff handing out flyers for another protest of Al Gore saying "Stop medical apartheid." But there's only supposed to be 3 minutes for this section. So the long story short version is that in 3 months, the vice president of the United States reversed his position. 2 months later, that reversal became the policy of the President of the United States, which was our demand. 6 weeks later, after that, an executive order was issued, and this policy by press release became a policy in law. A few months after that, the cost of medicine fell from $10,000 per patient per year to $350 per patient per year. Now it's about $75 per patient per year. So 21 years ago, everybody told us that this was impossible. We were criticized by liberals, we were criticized by AIDS groups, we were criticized by mainstream development experts, we were criticized by Bernie Sanders. But at that moment, we found an opening, and we stood up and refused to back down from racist trade policy that only benefits big pharma. And we're at a moment just like that, where we're in the midst of another freaking pandemic that's being magnified and amplified by spiteful, horrible people, leaders, the occupant of the White House. But there are cracks in the dam that are also created by this moment, and we're asking for y'all's help to be the crowbar to break that crack open and make sure that everyone everywhere gets the medicines they need in this country and in the United States, in this country and also in the United States and the rest of the world. Someone in chat points out, 25 million people have now gained access to those life-saving medicines that 24 people stood up and fought for 21 years and 4 days ago. So we hope that y'all can help take action. During this small group, we're going to talk about the actions that we can take, the bill that Afton described, going after Vice President Gore to implement some of the policies.
Biden.
Biden. and other things that are coming up on the calendar. So we appreciate y'all's help.
Sounds good, Paul. Thanks for sharing that. And thanks to all of, again, our panelists for all of your views and experience and background. I want to turn it over to Amu, who I believe will be helping us transition into the small groups. So let's do it. Let's get into that action.